How about the ability to? Well, you mentioned that we should have tried to find a peace or end this war once it broke out in February of last year. But well, given that we're here now in June of 2023, and yeah, the war is still raging on, and we appear to be losing. Is there any possibility of reaching a peace? I mean, from both sides, both from NATO or NATO and Ukraine, but also Russia on the other sides, because from the Russian perspective, they've well, from what I hear talking to Russians, their main thought would be, well, why would they trust us again? Because look at the Minsk agreement. The main assumption would be we would merely, yeah, agree to a ceasefire and use this time to rearm Ukraine and then fight another day. Yeah, much like the Minsk agreement. But also you hear similar arguments on NATO side that we can't have a ceasefire with Russia because this will allow Russia to rearm, regroup, and then fight another day. So we appear to have the same argument. The commonality, I guess, is zero trust in the opponent. So given that this is the case, even if we want peace, is there any possibility at all to sit down and agree to anything?
Well, keep in mind that, as I pointed out earlier, the Russian military in January, February of 2022 was much smaller, not nearly as well armed, and their goals and objectives at the beginning of this thing were actually quite modest. We changed that by trying to drag them deeper and deeper into conflict, thinking that if we could pull them into conflict, they would wear out, they would fail, they would collapse. And we continue to hear this nonsense all the time. Oh, Russian morale is terrible. Russian troops aren't any good. Generals are incompetent. Equipment's no good. It's all nonsense. It's exactly the opposite. All of those things can be said about the Ukrainians. So right now, the real question is, if you're in the driver's seat, why would you want an end to the war if you're sitting in Moscow? Well, because the Russians really didn't want a war to begin with. What they'd like to have is a good business environment. But we've destroyed that for them in the West. We've tried to use our financial system to destroy them. We've tried to harm them in any way we could with our sanctions. None of it's worked. And so you have something else happening right now in St. Petersburg in June. And that, I don't know if that's going to coincide with the Vilnius meeting for NATO, but I think they're going to be pretty close. And in St. Petersburg, you're going to have over 84 nations talking about how they can go to a new gold-backed currency system and begin trading with each other internally on the basis of a gold standard. And of course, the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the Saudis, and others have amassed enormous quantities of gold, so they can do business that way. We're not in the same position. In the meantime, we increasingly don't have the kind of support from the rest of the world that the Russians and the Chinese do. We made ourselves pretty unpopular over the years. So how do we get an end to this thing? We have to say something we don't want to say. Let's talk without preconditions. Number one, no preconditions. And hear what the Russians say. Remember, the Russians sent us several proposals. We wouldn't even consider them. This is back in December and January of 2022. We just dismissed them out of hand. So we haven't listened. Are we prepared to listen now? And as you're pointing out, you don't think so. But I think the Europeans, if they change the heads of government, at least in key states, and they change the nature of the people that they send to negotiate, I think there's a chance for something good to happen. But if you pick someone like this woman, Baerbock, this foreign minister who behaves like an American teenager in high school, trying to demonstrate for some silly cause in 1969, you're not going to get anywhere. I mean, if I were Lavrov, I wouldn't take her seriously. I wouldn't pay any attention to anything the woman said. So you got to get rid of these people and then send somebody who's serious. I mean, everybody took Helmut Schmidt seriously. Everybody took Kohl seriously. I mean, these men had stature. They had experience. They had credibility. Now, Gerhard Schröder was a bit of a disappointment, but he didn't change too much. But the real problem we had was with Merkel, who, as you point out, turns out to have been part of the big lie at Minsk. So she and anybody associated with her is going to, raise real questions in Russian minds. But I think the Russians would like to see this go away. By the way, cheap energy is absolutely vital to the success of any civilization. Civilizations are built on it. People talk about human slavery. Slavery was cheap energy. That's how great civilizations began. The point is, we've got to go back to it. Now, how do we get cheap energy? In the United States, we've destroyed the energy sector. And what by that I mean that the big firms that build the refineries and extract the oil and the petroleum and everything else and the natural gas, they're not extracting beyond what they've already got because they see no incentive to do so. You have a similar problem right now in Europe. The Germans just shut down the last nuclear power plant. And somebody said, well, we have to do that for climate change. Well, I don't even want to waste time on that subject. But let's assume that your concerns about climate change are figuring prominently. Do you destroy everything that you have before you have a viable alternative? Do you really think you're going to live on windmills? It's sort of nonsense. There was no thinking, which is extremely un-German, by the way. I would have thought that the Germans would have said, look, we share these goals. However, we cannot reach X, Y, and Z given current circumstances, or we put our economy at risk, we put our standard of living at risk, we put people's jobs at risk. Well, all of that caution was thrown through the window. So when do we get new governments? People that are rational and sober and recognize that things can be done, but not as rapidly as they'd hoped and not as radically as apparently they've supported. I think Putin is going to wait a certain amount of time, but then he's not going to wait forever. And if he has to move all the way to the Polish border, he'll do it. I don't think anybody should question that. And I don't see any evidence. Maybe you do, Glenn, but I don't see any evidence for anybody in Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, France, mobilizing their countries for war. Do you?
No, the war, all the suffering, human suffering from the war is obviously on the Ukrainian and Russian side in this war, primarily Ukraine. But I thought it was interesting the economic aspect, because this appears to be what will break the Europeans. You mentioned this. The meeting now in St. Petersburg. This is the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. What's interesting with this was when it's set up, it was because it's in St. Petersburg, which is the European city of Russia. It was meant to attract European investment, to integrate Russia into Europe and have this greater Europe. It's on from the 14th to the 17th of June. Actually, I'm presenting on a couple of panels there this year. But what is interesting is now this year it will almost, because of the absence of the West, it will almost be a event for the opposite of what was intended. Now it's to connect closer with countries in the East. So that's what I don't think many people appreciate in Europe either, that all their industries, technologies, currency, all transportation, everything's being decoupled at the moment. And it's going to be a lot of economic losses which can't be regained, lost status here. But that's what I was wondering, if the US and Europeans aren't feeling the military pain, as we're not on the front line dying, but because the Ukrainians are dying for us. Do you see any concerns, being your presence in Washington? Do you see any, knowing Washington at least, is there any concern there about the economics, not just the dollar, of course, taking some punishment, but the general geoeconomic infrastructure of the world shifting away? Is this something that can incentivize Washington to talk to Russia, or is it all about what's happening on the battlefield?
Well, if the majority of people in Washington, on the Hill, that is in the Senate, the House, as well as in the government, were rational, I would say yes, but they're not. Remember, they look through this lens that was formed by them in the 1990s. They look through this lens that tells them that Russia is weak and backward and corrupt and can be bullied. It's just a matter of time. That's their view. They look at themselves and they think that we are the power we were in 1991. When I deployed to the Persian Gulf in 1990, we had 5,000 fighters in the air that we could put against the opposition, the opponent. We still had just a little less than 800,000 men in the United States Army. So we could field 300,000 troops on the ground. We had no opponent at sea at all, a Navy with nothing to do but transport our forces and equipment and ammunition. Well, all of that's gone. we're not the same nation. We don't have those forces any longer. We'd be lucky to have 500 to 1,000 fighter aircraft, even with our allies. I think there is a failure to understand reality in Washington, D.C. The only way that we're going to get any change here is for things to get much worse economically. I think they're headed that way, but not as quickly as they are in Germany and on the continent of Europe. It's going to get worse there faster. That's why I think there's a chance for change in Europe before there's any change here. Remember, we're still stuck with the same government, at least in theory, until January 20th, 2025. They can continue to do a lot of damage and make more bad decisions. Decisions like the ones that have ruined our energy sector, decisions that have harmed our agriculture, decisions that have harmed our manufacturing. This is going to continue. Look at the open borders. Conceivably, we could face a situation where we're dealing with fifth column elements inside our own country, inflicting damage on us. What kinds of forces do we have to put against them? This is the problem. We're just not realistic in appraising ourselves. And when you go to war, which is what we chose to do when we built up Ukraine, we were planning this war for a long time, and we were convinced that we would beat them, using the Ukrainian forces with our backup. That hasn't worked, but we still think it's possible. We're hoping against hope. There's an unwillingness to see reality. And I think it's going to come back to haunt us in major ways. I don't know if your viewing audience is aware, but we're now seeing anti-tank weapons and more sophisticated gear that we have provided to the Ukrainians show up in the possession of the drug cartels in Mexico. They're walking around with these weapons that they've purchased ostensibly through intermediaries from Ukraine. This is not a good sign. And we do have a hostile neighbor on our southern border. We pretend that he's not hostile, but it is, because it's organized crime. You have an organized crime state on our border. This is a very serious problem. And Americans are going to have to come to terms with it. If something erupts there, everyone here will forget instantly about anything happening in Eastern Europe. And most Americans are not paying attention to what's happening in Eastern Europe. We're not allowing them to know that Americans have been killed or wounded in Ukraine. And they have. But no one's announced it. No one will tell the truth about it. And Americans just sort of listen to the news, say, oh, well, I guess these Ukrainians are going to really destroy these Russians. Just give them a couple of more weeks and this will all be over. Look, the Russians are on their last legs. That's what people think. That's all they hear. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the same thing in Europe. It's not true.